What doesn't kill you makes you stronger. We've all heard that, and when we're talking about challenging ourselves to achieve more, it can be a useful idea. However, when we're talking about children, research tells us that adverse childhood experiences don't make us stronger. In fact, they can negatively impact a young child's brain development and ultimately hinder that child's transition to healthy adulthood. Stay with us as we explore the impact of adverse childhood experiences in this episode of Explore Health. Major funding for Explore Health is provided by...
Doing great. I'm right here.
No te preocupes, aquí estoy.
Hey, Dad. I'm here.
I'm right here.
He's right here. Let's go.
Being here matters. That's why Blue Cross Blue Shield has thousands of people right here in Tennessee serving millions of members.
And if you need anything else, we'll be right here.
So when it matters, wherever you go, we'll always be right here.
Welcome to Explore Health. I'm your host, Ron Harr. We've got a big topic today. Adverse childhood experiences is a term that's been at the center of a lot of conversations here in Tennessee in recent years. In order to understand the impact on individuals and on our community as a whole, let's take a look at a recent discussion among community leaders addressing the opioid crisis in our community. While it affects us all, it's important that we don't lose sight of the smallest victims, young children.
We have tended, I guess, the traditional way of looking at problems is when we see someone who's struggling, the question that comes to mind in our society generally is, what's wrong with you? You know, why can't you pull it together? What ACEs does is it provides information and a platform that points very directly into the fact that we need a new way of looking at problems, and we need a new way of looking at people who are struggling.
ACEs is an acronym for Adverse Childhood Experiences, and it's a simple method to screen any person for just how traumatic their childhood was, which as it turns out correlates very strongly to poor health outcomes later in life.
One of the things that ACEs focuses on, or one of the major categories, is drug use in the household. You know, was one or more of your parents, did they have a substance abuse problem?
There is an opioid crisis in Chattanooga and in Hamilton County. There's an opioid crisis in rural America. There's an opioid crisis with employers who want to fill jobs and can't fill them because workers have a problem. And yes, sadly, there's an opioid crisis with babies.
The opioid crisis, because of just how destructive it is, it tears apart that family unit probably at greater depth than most things that you will see injected into a home other than deliberate violence towards another person. What we have oftentimes associated with trauma in law enforcement is the crime scene tape, it's the car crash. But now officers understand that it's those little injects of trauma as well that start to show up in homes, especially homes that are being ravaged by an opioid addiction, and understanding what the impact is on that child. It may not be the evidence of actual physical child abuse, but when you start to have conversations with that child, conversations with the parents, and understand how trauma has crept in and grown and absolutely started to tear apart that unit and change the trajectory of that child, that's where we're at right now, is understanding that and now starting to design programs of how we deal with that.
I'm proud that this community is coming together with different partners, and we're being proactive in addressing not only how we can come together as a coalition, but also how we can support each other from multiple sectors.
The early years of childhood, that's the foundation for everything else that happens, after that. That affects educational achievement. It affects physical well-being. It affects your employment opportunities, our public safety. It touches everything.
There aren't many issues that cut across every aspect of life, but this is one of them. I mean, you've got people from both political sides of the aisle, law enforcement, clergy, business, government, military, who all see that this is a critical issue to address.
As children grow older, what was the norm for them, but it was actually traumatic, becomes the norm for their children. We are generally products of the environment that we were raised in. The positive part is now it's forcing us to have conversations with so many different components in our community and an understanding of how they can impact ACEs.
A lot of this stuff is very easily offset just by, building strong relationships between children and caring adults. It doesn't have to be their parents, it doesn't have to be family, but having one positive, supportive relationship that's consistent with the child can make all the difference in how things turn out for them. And it's a great point of pride of ours right now that Chattanooga and Hamilton County is leading the state in getting out and getting this information out to the public and starting to make changes around policy and procedure, based on what we know from the ACEs research. It's a small start, but you have to start somewhere.
Joining us here in the studio to explore this topic is Dr. Bruce Perry. He's the co-author of the best-selling book, The Boy Who Was Raised as a Dog. He's the founder of the Child Trauma Academy, a not-for-profit organization based in Houston, Texas, that works to improve the lives of young, at-risk children. Thank you for joining us today.
My pleasure.
And we're honored that you're a Chattanoogan.
I love Chattanooga. I'm happy we moved here.
This is a really important topic, and we're hearing a lot about it in our community and around the country.
Yeah.
And basically, it comes down to the things that happen to children at a very, very early age affect them throughout their lives.
Exactly.
And you've been studying that for a long time.
About 40 years.
Yeah.
And it's the key thing that you said there, that I like the way you said that, is that experiences changed these children. And a lot of the dialogue has been about adverse experiences, bad experiences, and increasing risk for health problems, for mental health problems, for substance abuse problems. And that's all true when you look at it from an epidemiological perspective. But one of the most important things about our work and the work of a lot of others is that positive experiences can buffer those bad things.
Yeah.
And so whenever you talk about ACEs, adverse childhood experiences, I think it's equally important that you talk about relational health and connection to community, connection to family, connection to a healthy social network that can help you live through and sustain whatever stressors you experience.
Well, as I look through the list of what are considered adverse experiences, criminal activity in your family, physical abuse, emotional abuse, the death or mistreatment of someone who's very close to you.
Yeah.
And at that list, I look at it, and all of those things really are an absence of love. They're an absence of a positive thing.
And loss or an absence of a positive thing. And the other thing that's really important is that you can throw a rock and you're going to hit somebody who's had a bad thing happen growing up. I mean, you can't get through life without adversity.
Right.
It's just impossible.
So that's a really important point. It's not just, okay, you have an excuse for misbehaving because you had something bad happen to you as a child.
Right.
We all have had something bad happen to us, but there is a wide range, and some of those things are very, very serious and really change the way your brain develops.
Yeah.
Talk to us a little bit about that. We were talking about that before the show.
Yeah, one of the challenging issues here is that obviously the development of a human being is very complex. The brain has 86 billion neurons, and it's completely sensitive and malleable. So your brain's really responsive to changes in the world and the environment. And it's one of the strengths of our brain, and it's one of the strengths of our species. But this malleability also means that there's vulnerability if the external experiences are chaotic, if they're extremely traumatic, or if they don't have necessary elements, which is what we call neglect. So as you grow up, you're going to have all kinds of experiences where there's uncertainty or there's a stressor. And the truth is, one of the hardest parts of this process of trying to help people better understand adversity and development is people kind of think, oh, well, stress is bad. And they go, oh, don't stress the child because, oh my God, a test is traumatic. And there literally are people who think you shouldn't test kids because it's too traumatic. But their misunderstanding, really the biology, is that stress is actually good for you. You cannot get better at anything unless you're stressed. You can't learn how to walk unless you're stressed. You can't learn how to talk. You can't learn how to do a sport. You can't learn how to form a relationship unless there's stress. The key is the pattern of stress. So if it's moderate, predictable, and controllable, the kinds of stressors we provide in school for kids to learn new things, then you can get better. You develop resilience. But if stressors are unpredictable, if there's chaos, or if they're extreme, like a profoundly traumatic event, like seeing a parent get shot, or being in a community where there's continuous community violence, then the stress response systems have these abnormal patterns of activation that lead to problems.
We were talking before the show about the sort of the antidote to stress is having that safe place, and you have different words for it.
Connection, basically. Connection to healthy people is a buffer against stressors. Yeah. And so when you look at the adverse childhood experiences, the bad things that can happen, and the more of these that happen, the greater your risk is as you get older for problems with your health, problems with emotional functionings, problems with vulnerability to substance abuse. But if, on the other hand, you have relational wealth, you're connected in a healthy way to family, to extended family, to coaches and community of faith, you can have a lot of adversity and still do okay. And so what you always want to look at is the balance. What's the balance between the challenges and adversity somebody has and the relational wealth or relational poverty they're experiencing? And so if somebody has relational poverty, they're not connected to a community of faith, they don't have good connection to their neighbors, they have really lots of dysfunctional relationships in their family, and they have adversity, they're going to be at very high risk.
Yeah. Well, it's good to know that there's that positive side, and that's what we need to build to.
Exactly.
Let's talk a little bit about this topic and how it became to be so widely discussed in the healthcare community recently. There was a CDC study, right? Was that one of the first things?
20 years ago.
20 years ago.
20 years ago. And actually, preceding that, there were many people, including our group, that had done research on the relationship between exposure to combat and health problems. So we knew there was a relationship between stressors and physical health problems. Increased rates of diabetes, increased rates of heart disease, increased rates of hypertension, and so forth. Mm-hmm. But what the ACE study did, which was really good, it was an epidemiological study. Now what that really means is that they just asked a few simple questions of a lot of people. So it's like a 30,000 foot flyover. And so if you they took 17,000 adults, and they said, hey, here's 10 things that we call these adversities. And they just asked people, did these ever happen to you when you were younger? And you just check them off. And if you got 4 or more of these adversities, your risk for heart disease was the same as if you'd smoked 2 packs of cigarettes. And so when they started to find this out, they were like, whoa, I don't understand this. This is very unusual to see this, increased physical health problems just because you had adversity when you're young. Yeah. And in the beginning, they said, we don't understand the mechanism.
So there was that CDC study, then there was a Kaiser Permanente study, and then we have a Twitter question that's just come in while we're here asking, what are the limitations of these studies? Help me understand how that's...
Well, the study itself has lots of limitations. One of the things it did not look at is the timing of the adversity. And so it makes no distinction between something that happened when you're 2 years old and something when you're 12. Okay. And we know that makes a big difference. So if you have the very same bad thing happen to you when you're 1 year old versus when you're 15, the 15-year-old can deal with it much better than the 1-year-old can. Yeah. And so that's one limitation. The other limitation is that the study was done in a population of adults that were mostly middle class, Caucasian. And so that study specifically, we didn't know whether it was applicable to other populations. But since that time, That study's been replicated in almost every culture, in almost every community, and those correlations hold. And they are correlations, and this is the real limitation. If you go and look at the bad things that happened in your life, and then you go, oh, I also have asthma, you can't say that that caused your asthma. All you can say is that there's a correlation between your risk for having had asthma and these experiences. And I know that that's sort of a subtle difference, but it's pretty important.
It is really important. And as we think about this show, we started out to talk about a lot of the physical health problems, heart disease and COPD and diabetes. And this idea that our brains are so integrally involved in the rest of our bodies. I mean, it's almost laughable when you say it out loud, but we don't stop and think that way, do we, in our culture?
Don't. Yeah, we don't. It's funny. Even here I am. I'm a neuroscientist. I've been doing this stuff for 40 years. I still find myself saying when I'm teaching the brain and body, as if they're like, your brain is floating out here and the body is something separate. But they're interconnected.
Well, another thing we talked about earlier, I'd love to get back to a little bit, is about the cyclical nature of this. Just because of families and life and parenting and children, could you talk to us a little bit about the cyclical nature of adversity?
Yeah, there's a couple different parts to that cycle. One is the transgenerational cycle, that if you grow up and you have lots of adversity, you're going to think, you're going to have a worldview, and you're going to think and behave in ways that increase the probability that some of that will have impact on the way you parent. And so there's a transgenerational component to adversity. And there's also, with a lot of the adversities that we experience in our culture, there's a cyclical nature to the waxing and waning of community violence, for example. Right now, many of you who are listening are probably aware of the violence in Chicago, lots of gun violence, and it's terrible. But 25 years ago, when I was a young faculty member at the University of Chicago, the rate of the murder rate with guns was higher than it is now. And so there's, again, waxing and waning of community elements to adversity that are
and so you have community components of that. You have intimate family components to that.
Exactly.
Lots of different ways that stress is felt by an individual.
Exactly.
I'm fascinated, though, about this, the positive effects and how that can be so important.
Yeah.
And I'd love for you to talk a little bit more about that.
Yeah, I think it's interesting. When I first heard about the ACE study, and ultimately those authors contacted me, we wrote a paper together about the mechanism by which that phenomenon occurred. I talked about ACEs a lot because it was one of the ways, it was a really effective public engagement element. So, for example, when you tell people that abusing children is bad for them, everybody goes, oh yeah, that's bad, but they think that child welfare should take care of that and social workers can take care of that. But when you tell policymakers and people in the community that kids that experience trauma and adversity actually are going to have increased physical health problems, they pay more attention. And I don't really know why, but they do. And so one of the reasons the ACE narrative has been so compelling is that it does talk about increased risk for health problems. That has made people sit up and pay attention. But unfortunately, people now think, oh, let's do ACE surveillance on everybody. Let's measure ACEs on somebody. The problem with ACEs and scoring the adversities, getting that adversity score for somebody, is that it's not what we would call actionable. You can't do anything about it. It's happened. What you can do, however, is ask somebody how many people they're connected to. Do you belong to an after-school program? Do you have them go to the Mother's Day drop-in? You can measure and then act on connectedness. And connectedness counterbalances adversity. And so from a public health perspective, it's much more important to focus on who you're connected to than on what happened to you.
That's a great concept. And so we have so many support structures here in Chattanooga that are doing positive things. And so we say, well, you don't have any evidence that's working, what you're saying is that is the antidote to a lot of what we're talking about.
And there is evidence that that stuff works. I mean, there's a huge, robust literature about the relationship between physical health and connectedness, connection to healthy relationships, whether they're in a family, in a community, or in a program. And that appears to be the essential element in therapeutic healing. So if you have a trauma-related mental health problem and are at risk for suicide, for example, guess what is the most enduring, most positive finding about helping? Getting connectedness.
Well, several times you've mentioned age as it's such an important factor when these things occur, because by the time you're 15, you have more of a ability, hopefully, to deal with this than you do if you're 1 or 2.
Exactly.
So in terms of prevention, is that sort of the key, is to focus on very young ages?
I think prevention is really an essential element of sort of the long-term set of solutions. One of our most recent studies, and this is with thousands of kids, we've actually found that it's the experiences in the first 2 months of life that are better predictors of your outcomes than other things. So for example, and this is a little complicated, but I'll try to explain this well. If you look at a group of children who had a lot of bad stuff happen in the first 2 months of life, and then they were taken out of that bad environment and got into a good environment, and then they grew up, and looked at their functioning when they're 15, and compared it to a group of kids who had, for the first 2 months of life, no adversity and lots of good health, but then things fell apart in their family, and then they had bad adversity, they had bad things happen literally from age 2 months out to age 15. So they've got 15 years basically of crap versus 2 months of crap. The kids that had the first 2 months of crap have worse outcomes than the kids who had 15 years.
Wow.
That's because the brain is growing so rapidly early in life. And if you, in the first 2 months of life, are able to provide consistent, predictable, nurturing experiences to help organize, particularly the stress response system, it's inoculated. You have some resilience that you can use to deal with the stressors as you get older.
Wow. So maybe one answer to our viewers that are watching and say, what can I do about this in my family, is make sure that those newborns have nurture and no stress for the first 2 months of life.
And this is where sort of policy around, staying home with your babies,
paternal leaves,
the countries that provide very generous paternal and maternal leave so that they can support these young families and really reap the benefits of a healthier populace by giving people that 6 months of protected time.
Yeah. And if you were going to look at programs to assist, it would be around very, very young children.
Exactly.
Do you think there are cultural differences in pockets of the population about raising children?
Absolutely. It's interesting. And some of the most unhealthy early childhood practices we see are in people that have lots of resources. And it's not, and some of the healthiest practices we see are people who are very poor economically. But they're very nurturing and very loving and very consistent with their little ones. And, there are it's interesting. If you look at our society, there's a huge range of parenting beliefs and practices for young children. Now, as you get older, that kind of narrows out. But early, there's people that say, oh, don't, let him cry. And then there's people that say, don't let him cry.
Yeah,
and there's people
sleep
that
on
say,
your back, sleep on your front.
I know. So there's a lot of range of variation.
What a fascinating topic. I can see why you've been involved in this for 40 years. And it's been a great discussion. And I think you've certainly changed my mind about the term and what it means. And I hope our viewers can feel that way too after listening to what you've had to say today.
Well, thank you. And I think the key message is that, this ACE score that you have, it's not an inevitability. Really, it's much more important to think about and focus on the relational connectedness that you have currently and what you had when you were growing up.
And to build those positive buffers.
Exactly.
Because we'll all need them.
Exactly.
Well, thank you for exploring this issue with us. We want Explorer Health to be an information resource for you and your family. So visit our website to learn more about the show and to submit your questions about upcoming topics. You can also find links to follow us on social media. I'm Ron Harr. We'll see you next time. Major funding for Explore Health is provided by
Doing great. I'm right here.
No te preocupes, aquí estoy.
Hey, Dad. I'm here.
I'm right here.
Being here matters. That's why Blue Cross Blue Shield has thousands of people right here in Tennessee serving millions of members.
And if you need anything else, we'll be right here.
So when it matters, wherever you go, we'll always be right here.
For a copy of this program, call 423-702-7800 or email videoservices@wtcitv.org. Please indicate the program title, date, and time of broadcast.